huge sums of money went into the Trump administration in 2024, tune of $445 million from fossil fuel companies to,
when he was running? When he was
running, and $90 million into his own campaign. So these people are, they're very definitely in the pocket of those fossil fuel companies. So they will toe that line, whether they believe it or not. And we see that in UK politics as well. Significant donations are made to parties in this country from people who are climate deniers, significant polluters, or members of the fossil fuel lobby. So we've got to know that, we've got to see that, and we've got to understand the truth. And some of the misinformation that's perpetuated about the cost of net zero, for instance, well, renewable energies are significantly cheaper than fossil fuels. And
although it does cost a lot of money to make that transition, which consumers often have to pay.
Well, it's costing us a lot of money to subsidise the fossil fuel industry at the moment. That runs into billions of pounds a year that they get in tax breaks. And when we ought to be investing...
We also have significant windfall taxes on the fossil fuel companies.
Well... significant. Look, what about the significant profits that they're making? So we're suffering energy poverty. There are people in their homes this winter who are going to be making a decision about whether they cook a meal or turn the heater on. And meanwhile, the execs of the big fossil fuel companies are paying their shareholders enormous dividends to the tunes of record-breaking profits. I mean, we have a thing in the environmental world, we say polluter should pay. And ultimately, when it comes to planetary pollution, the fossil fuel companies are wealthy. They're still being invested in by those petro states. And as a consequence of that, money ought to be taken away from them and put into that transition. And I should say, for people that are working in those industries as well, we're not trying to facilitate mass instant unemployment here. No. We're saying that retraining and reinvestment in renewables is what we need to do. And we do have some support from that in the Labour government. Ed Miliband is absolutely a top bloke when it comes to all of these sorts of things. But as you and I know, he has his hands tied as much as many other decent public servants by the fact that the kitty's empty. The Treasury has got control over essentially a lot of what he would like to do.
I suppose some might say, Chris, and the Conservative Party would say this right now, I'm sure. In fact, I've interviewed them, so I know that they do. They would say that there is no path to a net zero future which goes via the route of making energy more expensive for consumers now, particularly in a moment when, as you say, there is so little money around, when people are extremely hard pressed. And the fact is that you're right. At some point, net zero or renewable energy will be very, very cheap, or could be very, very cheap. But funding that transition is really expensive. And ultimately, it is almost inevitable that consumers have to make a contribution to it. And that is a hard case to make at the moment, isn't it? When you have the Trump administration, the US still an enormous polluter, basically saying, we're going big on fossil fuels.
Yeah, but then again, it's a fallacious argument to say that there's no point in us doing anything, because basically, as you pointed out, the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese and the Indians are basically not fully signed up to this COP. They're not sending, significant delegations. I should add that the Chinese came in at the last moment and they've stated their revised targets, if you like.
Well, the Chinese are making huge strides on electrification.
Of course they are. Half the cars in China are electric. Half of the energy that's being generated there is through renewables. And most importantly, they're investing in exporting renewables to the rest of the world. When we finally wake up, the solar panels on all of our roofs are going to be made in China. My argument is that it would be wise at this point, if we care about our economy, cost of living crisis and jobs, to invest in us producing those sorts of technologies in this country.
Do you think that this government will be able to maintain the reputation that you've just alluded to, or at least with Ed Miliband, as being a leader on these matters, if the Rosebank oil field goes ahead?
No, I think this is make or break, because it's symbolic, basically. So we've got Rosebank, we've got the runway at Heathrow. Well, these are very totemic and symbolic.
Well, they've already said yes to the runway.
Well, it's not signed off yet, is it?
No, but the government's behind it.
The government have said that they're behind it, but let's wait to see what happens. We need to see the rubber stamp on the table. Ditto with Rosebank. Equinor are obviously, it has been overturned, and now it could rear its ugly head again. But those are very symbolic signs that point to just how green our government can be at this point in time.
I mean, they'll say that it's a legal
infrastructure bill.
They'll say that it's a legal matter. I've asked Ed Miliband about this. He says he's got to have a quasi-judicial role in the whole thing, and it's a legal matter, and therefore it's up to the courts with regards to Rosebank.
Well, it's up to the courts, but ultimately, the British people will have a say in that.
You think the government should step in?
I think the government should step in if they want to be that green government. And as we heard Starmer say, prior to the COP this week, that the UK is going to maintain its commitment, irrespective of what is happening in the United States and other parts of the world.
You're going to talk about the fact, your words with regards to the national emergency briefing that you're going to hold. We're at war with the earth. Our one and only home, we must act now. Tell us about this briefing. What's the name of it?
One of the things that concerns me is that our decision makers are not able to access the science. They're able to access the misinformation that's being pumped out from the think tanks, because those think tanks are highly effective, they're well funded, and they've been in practice for a long time. What I want to do is to bring science back into their equation. Now, the last time we had a briefing of this nature, where essentially climate science, but we're not just talking about climate, we're talking about human health, we're talking about security, we're talking about food security. Was it way back in 2022? Only 1 in 6 MPs turned up. Well, since 2022, believe it or not, things have got worse. You only need to turn your TV on to see that the extreme weather events are getting more extreme and more regular. Climate change, unlike football, is coming home. And as a consequence of that, we want our decision makers to be able to listen to the best informed advice so they can make best informed decisions. So that's why we are asking as many MPs and peers to come along to Westminster Hall on the 7th of November, where we will have a team of experts, people who are invested in understanding the grave nature of this crisis, to explain to them, the absolute truth about it, not the misinformation that's perpetuated by those with a vested interest in bad business as usual.
But Chris, isn't it the case? I would wager that at the moment, it might be different after the next election, particularly if there were a reform government, but right now, I think a majority of the House of Commons, clear majority of the House of Commons, would probably agree with you on the science. They would probably go along to that briefing and and nod gravely to the whole thing and worry about it. But there is still a sort of quasi-consensus about that. It's not as strong as it was, but it's still a reasonable degree of consensus, I would say, at the moment in the House of Commons on that. What there is less consensus about is what to do about it and how fast to move. And you say it's about misinformation, but that isn't about misinformation, is it? That's just about different political priorities and different political choices, not the science, not the diagnosis, but the prescription.
Well, I think there is. If there's no ambiguity about the science, so we're all agreed that climate change is happening, we're precipitating it, and it's getting worse. That's what the scientists are telling us.
And I think
that's
most
what the
MPs would still go along with that.
That's what the UN, that's what the government's own independent climate change committee is telling us. Okay, but then we've got to apply that, to protect the British people, and by denying that net zero in its broader form is a sensible method of progress, directly counters that. We have to make those investments at this point to secure not just our future, but the future of everyone else. And surely, doesn't Britain want to be seen as a leader here? We have the capacity to lead. We've got the brains. We've got the ability to lead on this. Yes. Why leave it to others?
Yes, but politics is about choices, isn't it? And you could say that whether we try and get to net zero by 2040 or 2050 or 2060, that is a political choice, because what it will involve is trade-offs on other things. If you try and do it more quickly, that probably means that it's more expensive.
You can try and make it a political choice, but I would argue it's an environmental no, it's not. It's an environmental and biological choice. If we don't do those things, the cost of repair afterwards, if we can repair things afterwards. Remember, we've got these identified tipping points, and a tipping point was reached just a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of people are going to think, okay, this is fairly ambiguous. So what the scientists have said is that ocean warming has got to a point that the world's coral reefs now will go into terminal decline. They are not going to be able to recover. And people will say, okay, well, there's no coral reefs in the Thames, there's no coral reefs in my local park. It doesn't mean anything to me. Fish breeding ground.
But the British government, we could end our carbon emissions tomorrow.
Yes.
And that wouldn't change. Wouldn't change. What's happening to the global temperatures and what's happening to the sea temperatures would not change, because Britain is simply a not sufficiently big contributor anymore to carbon emissions. So what I'm saying to you is that it is a political choice in that context for what Britain does or doesn't decide to do.
It's not about Britain. It's about humanity.
The British government has no power over what
the British government does have a power, and we've exercised that power previously. We stood up out on the streets today. Are the relatives of a lot of extraordinarily brave, servicemen and women who have given their lives to fight for ideologies which we believed in. Now, cast your mind to the middle of the last century. That was a fight against fascism, and no one would argue that that wasn't a fight that they needed to take at that point. Okay, that put our species under an enormous amount of global stress. It was a world war. We have tragic wars taking place at the moment, but that was a world war. And in response to that stress, our species responded, and we were at the forefront of that response in terms of, devising technologies and techniques to overcome that grave threat to humanity. The threat of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss is much greater than that.
And we needed the United States and we needed the Soviet Union. We couldn't do it on our own. So you could, to use your analogy, it's exactly the same.
But we led them, and that's the point. And ultimately, Lewis, if we don't do it, right, if everyone doesn't do it, then we're all doomed.